On a freezing winter night, the wind howled mercilessly as snow blanketed the ground. Inside a warm house, a man was preparing for another quiet evening when a faint scratching sound interrupted the silence. Curious, he opened the door, and there she was, a German shepherd, trembling uncontrollably, her coat covered in frost, and by her side, a frail, barely alive puppy. Her pleading eyes said everything words could not. What happened next would become a story of compassion, resilience, and an unbreakable bond that will leave you in tears. James Coleman had always loved the quiet of winter nights. His small house sat at the edge of town, surrounded by snow-covered trees and open fields. The isolation suited him. Since losing his wife 2 years ago, solitude had become his companion. That night, the snowstorm was fierce. The wind rattled the windows, and the temperature had plummeted to dangerous lows. James stoked the fireplace, grateful for the warmth inside, when a faint scratching sound reached his ears. At first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks, but then it came again. Persistent, desperate. Frowning, he grabbed his coat and moved to the front door. The cold hit him like a wall as he opened it, and what he saw stopped him in his tracks. A German shepherd stood shivering on his porch, her coat matted with snow and ice. Her ribs showed through her fur, and her legs wobbled with weakness. Beside her, a tiny puppy lay motionless, its small chest barely rising and falling. James knelt, his heart aching as the mother looked up at him. Her amber eyes were filled with a silent plea, "Help us." Without hesitation, James scooped up the puppy, cradling it in his arms. "Come on," he said softly, motioning to the mother. She hesitated, her body trembling, but followed him inside. Inside, the warmth of the house was a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. James laid the puppy on a blanket near the fireplace, gently rubbing its tiny body with a towel to generate warmth. The mother stood nearby, her eyes never leaving her pup. "Easy now," James murmured, his voice soothing as he worked. The puppy let out a faint whimper, its first sound since arriving, and James felt a flicker of hope. Turning to the mother, he noticed her condition was just as dire. Her paws were raw, her fur covered in ice, and exhaustion radiated from her. He grabbed another blanket, draping it over her as she lay down beside her pup. "What happened to you out there?" James asked softly, though he knew he wouldn't get an answer. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the small family began to settle. James watched as the mother nudged her puppy gently, her nose brushing its tiny head. It was a gesture of reassurance, a reminder that she was there. As James sat by the fire that night, his thoughts were heavy. He couldn't shake the image of the shepherd's eyes, filled with desperation and determination. She had braved the storm to save her pup, and now it was up to him to save them both. The warm glow of the fire flickered against the walls as James carefully monitored the mother and her pup. The room was quiet, save for the crackling of the flames and the soft breathing of the dogs. The puppy was still weak, its tiny chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. James couldn't help but worry. He knew the odds of survival for something so small and fragile in this weather weren't in its favor. He grabbed his phone and searched for the nearest emergency veterinary clinic. To his frustration, the nearest one was almost an hour away, and the snowstorm outside made traveling nearly impossible. "Hang in there, little guy," James muttered, his voice soft but firm. He glanced at the mother, who had curled protectively around her pup. Her amber eyes met his, filled with exhaustion, but also trust. It was as if she understood that he was doing everything he could. James decided to act quickly. He retrieved a small dropper from his kitchen and filled it with warm water, gently trying to hydrate the puppy. The tiny creature barely moved, but it managed to swallow a few drops. Encouraged, James repeated the process, speaking to the puppy in a soothing tone. "You're a fighter, aren't you? Just like your mom." The German shepherd watched every move he made, her ears twitching at the sound of his voice. Occasionally, she would nuzzle the pup, licking its small head as if to reassure both herself and her baby. James marveled at her strength and determination despite her clear physical weakness. She hadn't eaten or rested properly in who knew how long, yet her focus was solely on keeping her pup alive. As the hours passed, James made a makeshift bed for them near the fire. He laid down an old comforter and placed several towels over it for warmth. The mother hesitated for a moment before settling onto the soft surface, pulling the puppy close with her nose. James sat back, watching the scene unfold with a mix of awe and concern. The storm outside continued to rage, the wind howling like a beast in the night. James found himself lost in thought, wondering what had brought them to his door. He couldn't help but imagine the hardships they must have faced out in the wilderness. Had the mother been abandoned? Had she run away, desperate to find a safe place for her baby? The questions gnawed at him, but he knew they didn't matter now. What mattered was keeping them safe. Eventually, James noticed the mother's eyelids drooping. She fought to stay awake, her head jerking slightly each time she nodded off. "It's okay," James said softly. "You can rest now. I'll watch over him." The mother seemed to understand. With one last glance at James, she let her eyes close, her body finally succumbing to the need for sleep. James leaned back in his chair, his own body weary, but his mind alert. Every so often, he checked the puppy's breathing, relieved each time he saw its small chest rise and fall. The firelight danced across the room, casting shadows that seemed to mimic the rhythm of the life they were fighting to save. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, James felt a flicker of hope. The puppy stirred slightly, letting out a faint but unmistakable whimper. The mother woke immediately, nudging her baby and licking its face. James smiled, feeling a weight lift from his chest. "You're not giving up, are you?" he said quietly. "Good." He stood and stretched, his body aching from the long night. He knew the battle wasn't over, but this small sign of life gave him the strength to keep going. "Let's see what we can do about breakfast," he said, heading to the kitchen. The dogs had a long road ahead of them, but James was determined to walk it with them, step by step. The morning sun filtered weakly through the gray clouds, its light reflecting off the thick blanket of snow outside. James busied himself in the kitchen, carefully preparing a small bowl of food for the mother. He mashed soft bits of chicken and rice, ensuring it was easy for her to eat. Her condition was just as critical as her puppy's, and he knew they both needed nourishment to regain their strength. Returning to the living room, James found the mother awake and alert, her eyes trained on her pup, who now lay with slightly steadier breaths. The improvement was small, but it was enough to give James hope. "Good morning," he said gently, kneeling by her side. "I brought you something to eat." He placed the bowl near her, careful not to startle her. At first, she hesitated, sniffing cautiously before taking a tentative bite. Within moments, she was eating ravenously, her hunger overcoming her hesitation. James smiled, feeling a pang of relief. "That's it. You've got to take care of yourself too." As the mother ate, James turned his attention to the puppy. The tiny creature lay nestled in the folds of the blanket, its fragile body still but not lifeless. James gently ran his finger along its back, feeling its slight warmth. "You're hanging in there, little one," he murmured. "You're stronger than you look." The mother finished her meal and immediately returned to her pup, curling around it protectively. James watched as she licked the puppy's fur, her actions careful and deliberate. It was a reminder of her resilience, her unwavering instinct to care for her baby even in the face of exhaustion. "You're an amazing mom," James said softly, his voice filled with admiration. As the day progressed, James focused on making his home more comfortable for his unexpected guests. He added extra blankets near the fireplace, ensuring the space stayed warm and inviting. He also ventured outside to clear a path through the snow, should he need to make a trip to the store or the vet. The storm had left drifts several feet high, but the work gave him a sense of purpose. Inside, the mother began to show signs of improvement. She moved more freely now, occasionally standing to stretch or reposition herself. The puppy, though still weak, let out faint whimpers that indicated growing strength. James found himself smiling more often, encouraged by their progress. That evening, as the fire crackled softly, James sat on the floor near the pair. He held a book in his hands, but his attention was divided. Every few minutes, he glanced at the mother and her pup, reassured by their steady breaths. The mother seemed to sense his presence, her eyes occasionally meeting his with a calm, trusting gaze. "Do you have a name?" James asked aloud, though he knew she couldn't answer. He thought for a moment, studying her dignified demeanor and the quiet strength she exuded. "How about Grace?" he suggested. The name felt fitting, a tribute to the determination and resilience she had shown. Grace tilted her head slightly, as if acknowledging the name. James chuckled. Grace it is, then. Over the next few days, Grace and her puppy continued to improve. The pup, now able to lift its head and wiggle its tiny paws, began showing signs of life that James hadn't dared to hope for. Grace, in turn, became more confident, moving around the room and even venturing a few steps away from her baby to explore. James documented their progress in small ways, snapping pictures with his phone, jotting down notes about their milestones. He wasn't sure why he felt compelled to do so, but something about their journey felt important, worth remembering. One evening, as James sat by the fire with Grace and her pup resting nearby, he realized how much his life had changed in just a few days. The silence that had once filled his home was now replaced by the soft sounds of breathing, the occasional whimper, and the comforting presence of 2 lives he had saved. "You've brought life back into this house," James said quietly, his voice tinged with emotion. "I didn't even know how much I needed that." Grace lifted her head, her amber eyes locking with his. In that moment, James felt a connection he hadn't experienced in years, a bond forged not by words, but by trust, compassion, and shared resilience. Days turned into a week, and the rhythm of life inside James's small cabin began to feel natural. Grace and her pup were no longer trembling bundles of fear and exhaustion. They had started to show signs of recovery, each small step forward a testament to their resilience. For James, the once quiet solitude of his home now felt vibrant and alive, filled with the warmth and purpose they had brought into his life. Grace had grown protective but no longer hesitant around James. She now followed him around the house, her amber eyes watching his every move with quiet curiosity. The puppy, still unnamed, had begun to wiggle and lift its head, tiny signs of strength that gave James hope. He often found himself talking to them as though they could fully understand. "You've got quite the little fighter here, Grace," he said one morning as the pup let out a small squeak while trying to move toward its mother. The weather outside had improved slightly, though the remnants of the storm still blanketed the ground in thick snow. James decided to step out for supplies, leaving a bowl of food and water for Grace and ensuring the fireplace was well stocked with wood. As he grabbed his coat, Grace let out a low whine, her ears pinning back. "It's okay," James reassured her, kneeling down to stroke her head. "I'll be back soon. You're safe here." Grace nuzzled his hand, her trust evident in the way she leaned into his touch. The drive to town was uneventful, though James found himself hurrying through the aisles of the small store, eager to return. He picked up fresh food for Grace and her pup, along with a few extra blankets to make their space even cozier. The thought of them waiting back at the cabin filled him with a strange but welcome sense of responsibility. When James returned home, Grace greeted him at the door, her tail wagging softly. It was the first time he'd seen such an expression of happiness from her, and it warmed his heart. "Miss me?" he teased, scratching behind her ears before unpacking the supplies. That evening, as the fire crackled and snow fell gently outside, James decided it was time to name the puppy. He watched as the tiny creature nestled against Grace, its small paws twitching in its sleep. "You need a strong name," he mused aloud, glancing at Grace for inspiration. "How about Chance?" he finally said. "Because you're getting a second chance at life." Grace tilted her head as if approving, and James smiled. "Chance it is." As the days passed, Grace and Chance grew stronger, and their bond with James deepened. Chance began taking wobbly steps, his tiny tail wagging whenever James entered the room. Grace, though still cautious, started to relax, allowing herself moments of rest while James kept a watchful eye on her pup. One afternoon, James decided to take Grace outside for a short walk. Chance was still too small to venture out, so he remained snug in his bed near the fire. The snow crunched beneath their feet as James and Grace walked along the edge of the property. Grace sniffed the air, her ears twitching as she took in the unfamiliar scents. For the first time, James saw her move with a sense of ease, her body no longer weighed down by exhaustion. "You're doing great, Grace," James said, watching her explore. "You're stronger than ever." As they returned to the cabin, James felt a quiet sense of pride. He had given Grace and Chance a second chance, but in many ways, they had done the same for him. His once empty house was now filled with life, and his days were no longer defined by silence and routine. Instead, they were marked by moments of connection, small victories, and a growing sense of purpose. That evening, as James sat by the fire with Grace and Chance curled up beside him, he reflected on how much had changed in such a short time. The bond they had formed was unlike anything he had experienced before. Grace's resilience and Chance's determination had inspired him, reminding him of the power of compassion and the strength found in vulnerability. "You two have brought more to my life than I ever could have imagined," James said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Grace lifted her head, her amber eyes meeting his as if she understood. Chance let out a tiny yawn, his small body stretching before settling back into the warmth of the blankets. As the firelight danced across the room, James felt a profound sense of gratitude. This was no longer just his home. It was theirs, a place where second chances were more than just words. They were a reality, shared by three lives that had found each other in the most unexpected way. Winter began to loosen its icy grip on the small town, with patches of snow melting to reveal the damp earth beneath. The days grew longer, and the promise of spring was just over the horizon. Inside James's cabin, life was full of warmth and movement, as Grace and Chance continued their journey of recovery. Chance had grown noticeably stronger. He could now totter around on unsteady legs, exploring the small living room with curiosity. James often found himself laughing at the pup's antics, especially when Chance tried to tackle things far beyond his size. A stray boot, a cushion, or even Grace's wagging tail. "You're fearless, little guy," James would say, grinning as Chance tumbled over himself in his determination. Grace, too, had come alive in ways James hadn't anticipated. Her coat had regained its sheen, and her eyes, once filled with exhaustion, now gleamed with alertness and confidence. She no longer flinched at sudden movements or loud noises, a sign that she was beginning to feel safe. One afternoon, James decided it was time to take both Grace and Chance outside. The weather was milder, and he felt confident that the fresh air would do them good. Wrapping Chance in a soft blanket to shield him from the lingering chill, James carried him while Grace walked at his side, her tail wagging slightly. The trio ventured toward a clearing near the edge of the woods, where the sun shone brightly on the remaining snow. James set Chance down on a patch of dry grass, watching as the pup hesitated for a moment before taking his first tentative steps into the open world. Grace stayed close, her protective instincts on high alert as she observed her pup. "Go on, Chance," James encouraged, kneeling beside him. "It's all yours to explore." The puppy sniffed the air, his tiny nose twitching as he took in the unfamiliar scents. Slowly, he began to move, his paws crunching softly on the frosty ground. Grace followed closely, her eyes never leaving him. James watched with a mixture of pride and amazement. It was a simple moment, just a puppy exploring the outdoors, but it felt monumental. For weeks he had wondered if Chance would even survive, and now here he was, taking his first steps into a world full of possibilities. But the peace of the moment didn't last long. A sudden rustling in the bushes nearby made Grace's ears perk up. She let out a low growl, stepping protectively in front of Chance. James froze, his eyes scanning the tree line. From the shadows emerged a stray dog, thin and wild-eyed. Its fur was matted, and its ribs jutted out prominently. The dog didn't appear immediately aggressive, but its wary stance and hunger-driven gaze put James on edge. "Easy now," James said softly, holding his hands out in a calming gesture. Grace stood her ground, her growl deepening as the stray took a cautious step forward. Chance, oblivious to the potential danger, barked a tiny, high-pitched bark, as if trying to assert himself. The stray flinched at the sound but didn't retreat. James realized that the dog wasn't looking for a fight. It was desperate, just as Grace and Chance had been when they first arrived. Reaching into his coat pocket, James pulled out a piece of bread he'd brought for the walk. He broke it into small pieces and tossed one toward the stray. The dog hesitated before inching closer, its movements slow and uncertain. "It's okay," James murmured, keeping his voice steady. "No one's going to hurt you." Grace's growling subsided slightly, though she remained alert. James tossed another piece of bread, this time closer to the stray, who quickly snatched it up before retreating a few steps. After a few tense moments, the stray disappeared back into the woods, leaving James, Grace, and Chance alone once more. As they returned to the cabin, James couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. It reminded him of how fragile survival could be, especially for animals like Grace and the stray. He glanced down at Chance, who was now curled up in Grace's shadow, fast asleep after his big adventure. "You've got a strong mom looking out for you," James said quietly, scratching behind Grace's ears. "She's teaching you everything you need to know." That night, as the trio settled by the fire, James felt a deep sense of gratitude. Life was unpredictable and often harsh, but moments like this, of safety, warmth, and connection, made it all worthwhile. Spring had finally arrived, breathing life into the world around James's cabin. The snow had melted, revealing lush green grass and clusters of wildflowers that dotted the landscape. The air was fresh, filled with the songs of birds returning to the area. Inside the cabin, Grace and Chance had fully embraced their new life, and James found himself marveling at how far they had come. Chance was no longer the fragile pup who had arrived on James's doorstep. Though still small, he was now bursting with energy, bounding around the cabin with endless enthusiasm. Grace, ever the protective mother, watched over him with calm vigilance. Her transformation was just as remarkable. Her once thin and frail frame was now strong and graceful, her coat shining in the sunlight streaming through the windows. James had fallen into a routine he hadn't realized he'd missed. Each morning, he'd take Grace and Chance for a walk through the woods, their favorite spot being the meadow near the river. The same river where their story had begun now symbolized resilience and new beginnings. One morning, as James prepared their breakfast, he couldn't help but reflect on the changes in his own life. The quiet loneliness that had filled his days before Grace and Chance arrived was gone, replaced by a sense of purpose and connection. They had brought life back into his home, but more than that, they had brought healing. "All right, you two," James called, setting down a bowl of food for Grace. "Breakfast is served." Chance scampered over, sniffing the bowl curiously before trying to sneak a bite. Grace gently nudged him back, her maternal instincts still strong despite her pup's growing independence. After breakfast, they set out for their usual walk. The path through the woods was familiar now, with Grace leading the way and Chance trotting close behind. James carried a small bag with treats and water, always prepared for their little adventures. As they reached the meadow, Chance took off, his tiny legs propelling him forward as he chased after a butterfly. Grace followed at a more measured pace, her eyes never straying far from her pup. James watched them from a distance, his heart swelling with pride and affection. It was hard to believe that just weeks ago, Grace and Chance had been on the brink of death. Now, they were thriving. Each step they took a testament to their will to survive. As they approached the river, Chance hesitated, his tiny paws sinking into the soft earth near the water's edge. Grace stepped beside him, her presence steadying him. James crouched nearby, watching as the pup cautiously dipped a paw into the shallow water. "You've got nothing to fear," James said gently. "Your mom's got you, and so do I." Encouraged by his words, Chance took a few tentative steps into the water, splashing as he went. Grace stayed close, her watchful eyes never leaving him. James couldn't help but smile at the sight. It was a small moment, but one filled with so much growth and trust. That evening, back at the cabin, James sat by the fire with Grace and Chance curled up beside him. He had taken to keeping a journal, documenting their journey and the lessons they had taught him. Flipping through the pages, he paused at the entry from the night they had arrived. The words were filled with worry and uncertainty, a stark contrast to the hope and gratitude he felt now. "You've changed my life," James said softly, his voice filled with emotion. Grace lifted her head, her amber eyes meeting his. Chance let out a contented sigh, his small body nestled against his mother's. James reached out, running his fingers through Grace's soft fur. "I don't know how you found your way to me, but I'm so glad you did." The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow across the room. Outside, the night was calm, the stars shining brightly above the cabin. For the first time in years, James felt complete, a sense of belonging and purpose that had eluded him for so long. As sleep began to claim him, James whispered one final thought: "This is what home feels like." And with Grace and Chance beside him, he knew that home was no longer just a place. It was the bond they shared, a bond that had turned strangers into family. The days grew longer and warmer, and with them came the unmistakable signs of new beginnings. Grace and Chance had transformed in ways James couldn't have imagined. Grace, once frail and desperate, now carried herself with the confidence and grace of a proud mother. Chance, now brimming with energy and curiosity, had become the heart of the home, his playful antics bringing laughter and light to every corner of James's cabin. On a particularly beautiful spring morning, James decided to take Grace and Chance to the town park. It was their first trip beyond the familiar woods and meadow near the cabin. James wanted them to experience something new, a place where Chance could meet other dogs, and Grace could enjoy the open space without worry. As they walked through the park, heads turned. Grace's majestic presence and Chance's bounding enthusiasm drew smiles and admiration from passers-by. "Beautiful dog you've got there," an older man said, tipping his hat to James. James smiled proudly. "Thank you. They've come a long way." Chance, still small but full of determination, darted toward a group of children playing with a ball. His clumsy attempts to join the game drew delighted giggles as the kids tossed the ball gently in his direction. Grace stayed close, her eyes scanning the scene, ever the watchful mother. James found a bench under a tree, content to watch the joy unfold. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace, a certainty that life had led him exactly where he needed to be. But even in the midst of this joy, James's mind wandered back to the night they first met. He couldn't help but marvel at how a single moment, a desperate knock on the door, had changed everything. He looked at Grace now lying calmly in the shade and felt a lump rise in his throat. "You saved me as much as I saved you," he whispered to himself. That evening, back at the cabin, James prepared a special meal. It was a quiet celebration of how far they had come, a feast of roasted chicken for Grace and Chance, and a hearty stew for himself. The small cabin, once so silent and lonely, now buzzed with life and love. After dinner, James retrieved a small box he had prepared earlier. Inside were 2 engraved tags, one for Grace and one for Chance. He knelt beside them, fastening Grace's new collar first. The tag read, "Grace, my guardian, my family." She sat proudly as he adjusted it, her tail wagging softly. Then it was Chance's turn. His tag read, "Chance, my miracle." The little pup wriggled with excitement as James secured it around his neck. "There you go," James said, smiling. "You're officially home." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow across the sky, James, Grace, and Chance sat together on the porch. The air was filled with the sounds of crickets and the gentle rustling of leaves. Chance curled up at James's feet, while Grace rested her head on his knee, her eyes half closed in contentment. James ran his fingers through her fur, his heart full. "You two have given me more than I ever thought possible," he said softly. "You turned this house into a home." Grace lifted her head slightly, her amber eyes locking with his. In that silent moment, James felt the depth of their bond, a connection forged through hardship, trust, and unconditional love. As night fell, James carried Chance inside, the pup already fast asleep. Grace followed, her steps light but sure. The fire crackled softly, its warm glow illuminating the cozy cabin. James sat in his favorite chair, watching as Grace curled up beside Chance, their breathing synchronized as they drifted into peaceful slumber. For the first time in years, James felt complete. His once empty life was now filled with purpose, love, and the quiet joy of knowing that he had made a difference, not just for Grace and Chance, but for himself as well. As he closed his eyes, James whispered a final thought. This isn't the end. It's just the beginning. And with Grace and Chance by his side, he knew the journey ahead would be one of hope, love, and endless possibilities. Grace and Chance's journey reminds us of the incredible power of second chances and the unbreakable bonds we can share with animals. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with someone who loves inspiring tales. Together, let's celebrate stories of hope, resilience, and love.